So, right, so without further ado, let me introduce Catarina. So, Catarina Dutilh is a professor of philosophy and University Research Chair at the Department of Philosophy at VU Amsterdam, a member of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences, and President of the European Philosophy of Science Association from 2025 to 2029. So her research spans several philosophical areas and topics, including history and philosophy of logic, philosophy of mathematics, social epistemology, and philosophy of science. She's the author of, among others, The Dialogical Roots of Deduction, which won the 2022 Lakatos Award, as well as the forthcoming 2026 Reason and Power in Argumentation. Currently, she is primarily interested in the role of colonialism in science and epistemic practices more generally. So today, she'll be giving us a keynote on science for busy people. So let's welcome Catarina.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? No, this is off. Needs to be on. And then let me just make sure the clicker is also, yeah. And the clicker, yes. Okay, we're all set. Thank you. Thank you, Eugene. So first of all, thank you very, very much for inviting me. I've arrived last Friday. So I've been having a great time. Thank you so much for the hospitality, Jacob, Eugene, and everybody else. And yeah, so it's my first time in Singapore. It's my first time actually in this area of the world. And loving it. Obviously the food, but not just the food. Everything's just been amazing. So thank you so much for that. And yes, I'm also, as Eugene said, I'm particularly happy to be here representing APSA, the European Philosophy of Science Association. So in the sense, just as Craig was saying this morning as well, that, this is really, it's very nice to see that philosophy of science, globally speaking, is really picking up steam. And I think we should really kind of, join forces and collaborate. So the vision of philosophy of science that the current APSA steering committee has, not just me, but others, is of a global movement. So we really want to, encourage these dialogues across places and really kind of try to move away from Eurocentrism. So apologies on behalf of Europe for having been colonialist. But, I'm Brazilian, so, I don't count completely, so halfway. So yeah, so that's a very important idea for me to be here, also representing Europe, and also trying to forge this new way of doing philosophy, a way that's global, that's international, and that's cooperative in this way. Okay, right. So the presentation today is Science for Busy People. Let me explain the name. It's a very cool name, I know, but the thing is, I actually borrowed it from a political scientist called Kevin Elliott from Canada, I think. And he has this book called Democracy for Busy People. Right? And then when I was looking for a title for this particular paper, together, by the way, with my co-author Chaglar Dedi, we were looking for different things. We just couldn't find the right title. And then I remember the title of this book, Democracy for Busy People. And it was perfect because this is what I want to talk about today. Like, how do you do science when you're a busy person? And that's pretty much all of us, right? Okay, and also another thing to say is that this paper and the material I'll be presenting comes out of a research project that I was running for 6 years, funded by the European Research Council. And there were many people who worked with me on this project, postdocs, PhD candidates, and I'm very, very indebted to them as well for all the great ideas and the very inspiring meetings that we had. So this is collective work, not just with Chaglar, but also with the whole team, the whole team of the project, which is called the Social Epistemology of Argumentation. But here I'm going to focus specifically on argumentation in science, right? So first of all, just to state the obvious here, which is that argumentation is very important in scientific practice, even though philosophers of science don't usually talk about argumentation as a category. But of course, that's what we're doing all the time, right? Scientists are exchanging arguments with one another in different ways, and there are different types of argument, maybe perhaps in different disciplines, but there's this overarching idea, right, that what you're doing when you make a scientific claim publicly, that you have to support the claim by evidence, by arguments, and this has to follow communally accepted scientific methods, scientific standards. And what's interesting about argumentation in science compared to argumentation in other domains is that the bar for persuasion and plausibility is higher in science than in most other domains of life, because the scientist is required to offer further justification for the claims, especially when challenged by peers. Right? So if you're not a philosopher and you go to the pub in the evening and you're chatting with your friends and you say something, you know, just like tongue-in-cheek or whatever, and then somebody else says, yeah, but why? Why are you saying this? Give me your grounds. If you're a normal person, you say like, come on, give me a break. Right? You know, this whole thing about asking why, give me reasons. Of course, we philosophers, we've been trained to do this. This is why we're often not the most fun party participants. But most other people don't do that. You'd be surprised to hear. And but scientists do that when they're doing science, when they are in a scientific community. They have to justify, you know, when they say something, somebody says, tell me why you're saying this, give me your grounds. They have to give, you know, evidence for the claim. And of course, this idea of like asking why and kind of doubting, as it were, has been famously described by Robert Merton as organized skepticism. So there's a skepticism in the sense that you don't just take people's claims at face value when you're doing science, right? You need justification, you need argumentation, right? So scientific claims have to be exposed to critical scrutiny before being accepted, right? And we saw this morning with Craig Callender's talk, he was talking about the preprints, right? One of the problems with the preprint ecology, as it were, is that, well, you know, something anyone can just upload a paper in a repository. It hasn't really been vetted by peers, and yet, you know, if the press, you know, what is it again? The university press, what was the? Sorry, the press officer of the university picks up on it, and they just, you know, make a whole fussle about it, even though it hasn't been checked by peers yet. So that's one of the problems. And I want to say, of course, shout out to Jacob over there, who also, in his recent book, Heart of Science, has defended a view that I think is very much in that vicinity, right? He says that justification is at the heart of science, and what you mean by justification is what I think I mean by argumentation as well. So in that sense, we very much agree. No, wrong way. So, right, so there's this idea, argumentation is everywhere in science, right, in scientific practice. But how should we understand, right, these argumentative practices? They're, you know, ideal and idealized accounts of our scientific argumentation, and I think one of them, perhaps the most prominent one in recent years, has been Helen Longino's critical contextual empiricism. She doesn't talk about argumentation in these terms, but when she's talking about critical discursive interaction, that's what she means, right? It's basically the same thing. So, right, so this idea of critical, so the key idea of Longino's CCE proposal is that it's precisely the critical discursive interactions that provide the very basis for the objectivity of science. There's nothing to objectivity when it comes to science other than these discursive critical practices. So, right, it's been very popular. This account has been very influential, but it's also been criticized, in particular for being overly idealized and falling both descriptively, which is fine, right? You would agree, yeah, I never intended to have a, you know, to present a descriptive account, but also normatively, right? And what I did in this paper together with my co-author Chalar is we actually, so what we did instead is we applied this particular conception of argumentation called argumentation as epistemic exchange. So, you know, to use a sexy acronym, AX, which is the same acronym for the stock market in Amsterdam. The irony is not lost in me. So this model is the model that we developed with the whole team, you know, throughout the project, and we've applied it to different domains. But in particular with Chalar, we applied this model specifically to argumentation in science with the, you know, the hope that the resulting account will be less idealized, or at least idealized not in the kind of wrong ways as we think that Longino's account is, at least in some respects. Right? And then there's this general problem, of course, that I know many of you are interested in, is how far should idealization go in accounts of scientific practice? You know, we were having this workshop yesterday on Jacob's book, and, you know, in my comments I was making similar, you know, criticism of his book, and then some people were under the impression that I was against idealization, period. And I said, no, that's not true. By the way, it would be very odd for somebody who spent so many years working on philosophy of logic which is idealization, to the max. For me, not to like idealization at all. That's not the idea. But I think, there are some idealizations that make the wrong choices, as it were. Okay? Oh yeah, here's Helen Longino when she was receiving an honorary degree at my university, but that was before I was at the VU, but still, there's a connection between us. No, oh God, I keep reading. Okay, so this is what I'm gonna do. I'll briefly tell you about Longino's critical contextual empiricism and its critics. Then I'll spend quite some time talking about argumentation as epistemic exchange, right, presenting this account that we developed with the team. And then at the end, I will apply the account to peer review specifically, okay? Obviously, peer review being one of the cornerstones of modern contemporary scientific practice. So if you don't, basically if you don't want to be here listening to me, it's fine. You can just go and check the paper and leave if you prefer to read. But I think it's more fun if you stay because the paper doesn't have jokes. So, it's up to you. If you don't like jokes, then you maybe prefer to read the paper. So the paper is already out, right? So the results I'll be presenting are already in the paper. It appeared in the journal Topoi. Okay, so let's start with Longino and CCE. So just in a nutshell, in case, I don't think anyone here is completely new to Longino's CCE, but just, as a quick recap, and here are the covers of the two books where she defended and developed the view. So the idea is that knowledge production is an active and value-laden practice, and evidence is always context dependent and relies on background assumptions. So again, right, so that's where the contextual stuff comes in, right? But it's also in a form of empiricism. So far, so good. I'm completely on board so far, right? So yes, I'm also on board with the idea that evidence is context dependent and that there are lots of background assumptions playing a role. So far we are very much in agreement. And also this idea that science is a social inquiry, essentially social, that under certain conditions produces social knowledge with contextual objectivity. Right? So that's Longino. So how does that work in practice, right? So there's this idea about that science is necessarily a social enterprise, so they cannot be the lone scientists, just investigating things by themselves. Because scientists need to kind of keep each other in check, as it were, right? They must engage in critical discursive interaction. And, right, so the idea is that, within a community, the different people, the different scientists, they have subjective preferences, they have values. And, but these subjective preferences and individual values can be transformed into objective beliefs, frameworks, methods, criteria, concepts, etc., through this critical interaction. So it's in a sense the clash of the different perspectives and values that minimizes the role of partialities and biases, or the individual partialities and biases. Probably the story is familiar to most of you already. What I want to emphasize is that I read Helen Longino as very much of a Millian in the as a John Stuart Mill person. And again, yesterday also in the workshop we had, Mill was mentioned a few times. So I think that fits right in. I really read her as a Millian. And so my critique, in the book that's coming out of the project, I have lots of arguments against this kind of Millian optimistic idea. And all those arguments also apply then to Longino's account insofar as a Millian account. So what about, right, I mentioned before that while it's been very influential, this account also has been criticized. And some, on the one hand, it's been criticized as descriptively inadequate, and one of the people who have formulated these criticisms is Miriam Solomon. And so she says the following, so I have just a bunch of quotes because, she says it better than I would if I were to paraphrase her. She says, criticism, right, so talk about the kind of criticism that Longino talks about, criticism frequently results in the entrenchment of prior positions due to pride, confirmation bias, etc., right, contra Longino. Then she says also, Longino's requirement of equality of intellectual authority and responsiveness to criticism, which is two of the four pillars of Longino's CCE, while sounding reasonable, are not shown to be feasible or effective by application to particular cases. And then she continues a little further. In fairness, Longino explicitly regards her account of scientific objectivity as an ideal, which actual cases approach to a greater or lesser degree, resulting in degrees of objectivity. But even this more modest claim is not supported by cases. Right? So there's this descriptive inadequacy, because Longino's proposal is, while very much, of course, informed by feminist ideas and, contextualism, it's still a very idealized account. It's meant as an idealized account. So, but Solomon is saying even that is not supported by cases. And then there is also, there are also reasons to question the normative adequacy of CCE, right? So not just as a descriptive account, but also as a normative account. And here is a nice paper by Justin Biddle, which really kind of made points that I, had in my mind I was struggling to articulate them. I came across this paper, I was like, yes, exactly, that's what I mean. So the crux of it is that Longino's account is not normatively plausible for epistemic agents who do not have infinite cognitive resources and infinite time. Right? And therefore must engage in all kinds of difficult decisions on how to allocate their resources. And so here's some passages from the paper. The scientists who receive these criticisms, right, so in this kind of Mertonian process, may be simply uninterested in following them up. They may see that as a waste of time and resources and a diversion from the more important task of working out their program. Right? Because the scientist is having to make contrastive choices. Should I respond to this critic or should I actually go and run more experiments, right? And then he says also, progress in science is best ensured not by demanding of individuals that they be open to everything, that's a million requirement, but rather by distributing the resources of a community into various lines of research and letting each of these programs doggedly pursue its own course. Again, this idea of resource allocation, right, as being the key thing. So what I think, from what these authors have said, these philosophers have said, and then bringing in also, some of the results that we obtained in the project, I would say these are the main dead angles of CC. So these are the things that the account is missing, which I think are really essential in any account of scientific practice, even idealized accounts, idealized in the sense that, of course, you're kind of trying to distill some patterns, right, rather than describe every single little, specificity of each domain. So what's missing is an awareness of the costs and risks involved in extensive discursive interaction, right? So argumentation is not just, you don't only get good things out of it, there are also risks and losses involved. And secondly, there's this idea of the imperative of responsible collective workload management in a scientific community, right? So the community as a whole has limited resources, and the community as a whole makes choices on how to distribute those resources. And finally, there's also the point about the need for mechanisms of curation and filtering in any sufficiently large epistemic community. So the last point is a matter of scale. Right? So if you have a very small scientific community, say for example, like back in the 17th century, the Royal Society and stuff, there were maybe 20 people, right? And they could all read each other's works and it was kind of fine, right? They could do this. But the moment it gets larger, then you need curation and filtering mechanisms to distribute the attention of the community. So in view of what I take to be those dead angles, then now apply, this other account of argumentation, which now is a general one, right, not just for science, then I think one of the goals of this account was to precisely to avoid these these shortcomings of a million idealized accounts such as Longino's. So the key idea of the account is to take literally the the metaphor of argumentation as exchange. So this is something, of course, that we often hear, like John Stuart Mill is, people attribute to him the idea of the free exchange of ideas. People like Alvin Goldman and others, they often say, well, it's exchange. So this has been going around, right? What I did with the project when I was already writing it is like, okay, what if we take that literally? What if it really what's happening is a kind of exchange? And if, that's, in particular with respect to argumentation, what's being exchanged, the resources that are being exchanged are in particular epistemic resources, right? Not only epistemic resources, but importantly epistemic resources, because an argument always has some sort of like intellectual, cognitive content that needs to be processed. And what do I understand as epistemic resources? It's things like knowledge, evidence, justification, critical objections, defeaters, etc., etc. Okay? So if that's correct, right, if I can really take literally the idea that argumentation is a form of exchange, then one way to make an account, to produce a more realistic account of argumentative processes, is to look at the social science of exchanges and then see, what these social scientists have discovered about the actual patterns of exchange like out there in the real world. And lucky me, there was already like a fully fledged framework that had existed already for decades called social exchange theory, which had exactly what I needed to offer, right? So this account, this sociological account of exchanges, right? So in a very kind of structural way. So let me tell a little bit about this framework, right? Social exchange theory was started to be developed in the 1950s, 60s, developed by sociologists primarily and social psychologists, but very much inspired also by work in anthropology. So for those of you familiar with the history of anthropology, think Marcel Mauss, that's like the big name here to remember, also Malinowski. So these people were very much inspired by this sociological, anthropological work, also Lévi-Strauss actually. And one of the pioneers of the framework was this sociologist called Peter Blau. And here I have two quotes by him to illustrate the general idea. Social exchange refers to voluntary actions of individuals that are motivated by the returns they are expected to bring and typically do in fact bring from others. Then a little further he says, it involves the principle that one person does another a favor, and while there is a general expectation of some future return, its exact nature is definitely not stipulated in advance. So the contrast here is what at the time was this idea of the homo economicus, which was already quite popular back then. This idea that humans are always kind of being maximally opportunistic and only trying to maximize the payoff of each interaction, like on the spot. And social exchange theorists said, based on anthropological work, they said, no, that's not how people work at all. What we're doing is we're engaging in these diachronical relationships over time of exchanges, of continuous exchanges with the people around us. So I do my neighbor a favor today. Next week, my neighbor does me a favor. Right? So there's kind of like an economy of favors, as it were, and it's not kept track of kind of very precise way. So it's not like you're quantifying everything, but you kind of keep track, right? And from the social exchange theory point of view, what people don't tolerate is free riders. So that's the problem. The challenge is free riders. What do you do with free riders? Because everybody's exchanging with everybody else, and there's the idea, well, I'm contributing, and people are giving, doing favors to me, I'm doing favors to them, and it's all fine, like some sort of cosmic balance. But of course, there are always free riders who are then, taking advantage of that. So that's the framework. On the basis of this literature, then with my team, we developed this kind of three-tiered model of the structure of exchanges. And this three-tiered model applies to any kind of exchange, but in particular, we of course wanted to apply to argumentation or to other types of epistemic exchanges. So for example, testimony is also a kind of epistemic exchange. And the three levels of the model, first of all, there is the opportunity structure. So that's the structure of the network of who can exchange with whom, as determined by the potential relations of accessibility in the network. The second level is pertains to the contrastive assessments that people make between the different potential exchange partners that they have. Who do they take to be more interesting, more worthy of being considered as an exchange partner or not? This can be like a binary judgment, or it can be a ranking, right? So like, this is my most preferred partner, this is my least preferred partner. And then it's only at the third level that the actual exchange takes place. So the key idea is that most of these idealized accounts that I was talking about, and also in argumentation theory and in epistemology, they only look at the, oh, this doesn't work, at the third level, when the exchange is already going to happen, or it's already happening. Whereas we were interested in the conditions of possibility for the exchange to happen at all, and what happens before, right, as it were. And that's why we're interested in these two stages, these two prior situations that make exchanges possible at all. And just to show you that I'm not against idealizations, this is an idealization, right? So one of my idealizations is that, especially level 1 and 2, they're fairly kind of separate from each other, whereas obviously, in practice, there's a lot of like feedback loops between them, right? So, nothing of this is static, right? So you could say, well, but they're not really different. I know they're not really kind of, ontologically separate, but for theoretical purposes, it's useful to distinguish these two levels, okay? So this gives me then, like, to represent the three tiers, and now I'm really only looking at epistemic exchanges, okay? So I'm now moving away from exchanges in general. So at the first level, what's happening is, right, so and then, again, for simplicity, again, another idealization, I have like the one agent in the middle, and then the other agents around, whereas the actual network is like much more complicated with different agents related to other different agents. But at the first level, what you have is a representation of who the main agent in the middle can potentially exchange with. Like, who is this person paying sufficient attention to? And I usually like to illustrate this in terms of like the newspaper. Suppose the middle person there is me, wearing an orange t-shirt because it's the World Cup, and I also support the Netherlands, even though if Netherlands plays against Brazil, I'm supporting Brazil. Either way, we both did, both countries did terribly at the last World Cup, so they got resolved. But suppose it's like me wearing my orange t-shirt there, and around me, these are the possible newspapers that I could read, right? And there are newspapers that I don't even know exist. I know I have no access to them. They're not on the internet or whatnot. And these are like, in this case, it's D and G, right? So there's no accessibility relation between me and these newspapers. And the other ones are the ones that I could possibly read if I wanted to. By the way, shout out to Kevin Zollman over there, who has been doing amazing work on network epistemology. So at this level, a lot of what's happening is very much what Kevin and others have been investigating, with their very nice Bayesian models, although I'm not committed to Bayesianism, just making it clear. But yeah, so I mean, this work has been super important for me also to make sense of what's happening at that level. So that's the first level. But then at the second level, what's happening is that I'm the agent in the middle. I make judgments between the different newspapers that I could read, which ones are, worth spending my time on. Remember that I'm, facing a resource allocation problem. I only have so much time on a day to read newspapers, so I need to make choices. And so here I'm representing as a binary choice, right? So here, like the continuous lines represents newspapers that I think are, beyond a certain threshold, good enough for me to spend time on. And then A and E, I just think, they're really bad. Like, they're like, in the UK, they're like the Sun or Mirror or, so tabloids and stuff like that. But of course, again, this can be also a ranking instead of a binary judgment. And then finally, in the third level, this is when I actually go and read these newspapers, right? And here I have the thicker lines for B and C. These are the newspapers that I actually go and read. And F is there. I think F is okay, but, maybe it's less preferred than the other, so I didn't read that, okay? So that's it's a very schematic, very general structural account of these processes, okay? And from the literature on social exchange theory, there's a very nice distinction, again, which applies to all kinds of exchanges, not just epistemic exchanges, between 4 types of exchange. The first one, they call it negotiated exchange, and that's really when you're selling something to somebody. It's like a commercial transaction. There is an explicit agreement before of the terms of the engagement, right? And that's agreed upon, and once you exchange, you can like walk away and never see each other again, right? Because you're at zero there, as it were. Then there's reciprocal exchange. That's that exchange, you know, like I'm saying, my neighbor does me a favor, next week I do my neighbor a favor, and it kind of tends towards equivalence, broadly speaking, right? But there's no negotiation, and there's no guarantee that the person will reciprocate, right? There's no, right? You hope that they will, but maybe they won't. Maybe they'll be a free rider. So that's particularly that kind of exchange that was theorized early on in this literature. And that is contrasted with the homo economicus kind of, you know, negotiated exchange paradigm. But then they also say, well, there's also another type of exchange you could call generalized exchange. This is when I know I do something for somebody, and it's not that same person who does something for me back. It's just kind of more like a loop thing. That person does something for somebody else, and then for somebody else, and eventually comes back to me, okay? So eventually the original giver gets some benefit in return, but from a different person. Right? And that's also fine, right? It's like the system. And then finally, there's the idea of productive exchange. And this is when you really kind of get together and you jointly produce something collectively, right? Some collective good. And then people are unilaterally providing benefits to the group and then receiving, you know, benefits back from the kind of whatever good outcome that came out of this collaboration. So these 4 types of exchange, keep them in mind, because I'll come back to them when I'm talking about peer review. And I will discuss, you know, which kind of peer review as we know it, which kind of exchange does it correspond to on the basis of these categories, okay? So keep that in mind for later. So here's a graph from this particular paper, right? So reciprocal is when there's like, you know, going in both directions. Generalized is when there's like a loop thing, it kind of goes back to you. Negotiated here is represented by just this one arrow with both sides. That's synchronic, right? That's the big difference. And productive is when everybody's cooperating with like the middle thing, and the middle thing also then gives benefits back to everybody. Again, all these details, you can check them out, including the whole discussion of the social exchange theory literature in this paper of mine that appeared already 6 years ago. So it's open access, just go and check if you want more of the details on how it's grounded in the social exchange theory literature. By the way, one person who's also has thought about exchanges in this way and has also been influential for my thinking but not mentioned in this paper is David Graeber, the anthropologist who died 6 years ago, and he was very much influenced by Mauss. And, you know, I was also influenced by David Graeber, in particular the amazing book Debt, the first 5,000 years, or is it 10,000 years? Does anyone remember? Anyway, 5, right? Great book, okay? And it's very much in the spirit of what I'm talking about here. But in this paper, I don't talk about Graeber yet. All right, all this is going to be presented in this book called Reason and Power and Argumentation, which is due to appear in a few months from now. I've already done the proofs, you know, I've done all my part, so now it's all with the publisher for them to kind of get things done on time. So what the book does, the book has this very kind of broad project of investigating the limits of rational argumentation, right? Especially, I'm particularly interested in the role of power structures, how the power structures affect these argumentative processes, and in the inherent cognitive limitations of human beings. So one way you could understand this book is that it's like a Kantian book, broadly speaking, in terms of studying the limits of dialogical discursive rationality, right? It could be called Critique of Discursive Rationality, but that would be super pedantic, and then people would think I'm a Kantian and I'll get very offended because I'm not. But I do think that one way you can understand this project is a Kantian project, broadly speaking. And one thing that's very, much emphasized in the book is that reason does have power. There is such a thing as the power of good arguments, the power of good reasons. And here there's this famous phrase by Johann Habermas, the idea of the unforced force of the better argument. By the way, we talked also a lot about Habermas and Rawls and Mills yesterday, so that's where it comes from. And what I say in the book is that the power of reason is just one of the kinds of power that permeates social reality, and therefore that have an impact on these epistemic processes, these argumentative processes that I'm interested in. And right, so the power of reasons is constrained and affected by all kinds of power, all the types of power, such as strategic power, economic power, political, epistemic, social, emotional, etc. Okay? So what I'm interested in is really studying how these different types of power interact in epistemic processes, in particular in argumentative processes. By the way, if you're wondering what's my notion of power here, does anyone have a guess? Like who's influencing me? Like whose notion of power am I kind of, anyone? Like a philosopher who has, or a thinker, historian who has thought of power? Foucault. Yeah, okay. So happy to talk about that in Q&A if people are interested. So very briefly, the structure of the book, right? The first chapter is just to say, look, we have a problem because people are very much disagreeing with each other on whether argumentation works or doesn't work, and in which context and which not. So, right, so to motivate, look, you need a book like this because, it's a bit of a mess in the literature. The second chapter presents the model that I was just describing to you, and also connecting to the work of David Graeber and the social exchange theory. Then the 3 chapters after that, they look at each of the 3 levels that I was describing. So chapter 3 is on the argumentative networks, chapter 4 on assessing argumentative partners, and there I talk primarily about trust. And my case study in that chapter is about vaccine hesitancy. So also happy to talk about that if people are interested. And the 5th one is about what happens when the arguments actually get exchanged, when the exchange actually happens. So this is the theoretical part of the book, as it were. And then the practical part of the book, the applications of the model, it has 4 chapters. The first one is scientific argumentation. That's the one I'm talking about today. But also this chapter also has a second part on public engagement, right? On argumentation between scientists and the public, or the publics, I should probably say. So it has this part about argumentation between scientists, which is what I'm talking about today. But I'm equally interested in how argumentative processes take place between scientists and society at large. Then I have a chapter on political argumentation, another one on argumentation on conspiracies, which is always very kind of sexy. People love to talk about conspiracies. So also happy to talk about that if people want in Q&A. And then the final one is argumentation online. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the chapter 6 and actually one half of chapter 6. How much time do I still have? I've been talking for like 35 minutes, right? 35 minutes. Yeah, so that's good. Yeah, so I need maybe like 15 at most. Because now we're going to turn to peer review. And that's what you've all been waiting for. You want to know whether I have an answer to the peer review crisis. And sorry to say, no, I don't. Okay, I do think I offer like an interesting diagnosis of why it is so fucking complicated. Right? Why it's so vulnerable, but I don't really have an answer to like how to fix that, especially because I think, it's not just about fixing the peer review system. The peer review system is embedded in a much broader, context of, capitalism, and, you can get very grand on that. So that's why there's no simple solution. But anyway, let's look at peer review, and in particular, I'm going to apply the AX model, or the 3 tiers of argumentative exchanges. I'm going to apply them specifically to peer review. So some platitudes again, right? Some obvious things. Peer review is one of the cornerstones of contemporary science. I think nobody would disagree with that. And I think you can say that it's the embodiment of Mertonian organized skepticism, right? This idea that peers keep each other in check, right? Again, it's also very Longino-like, right? The theme. And it's a very important mechanism for quality control in science, right? So it's very important. And I think that those idealized models of scientific practice, including Longino's, but I think to some extent also Jacobs' idea of the heart of science and justification, and others, I think they don't sufficiently emphasize the high costs that are involved with engaging in peer review. And when I say peer review, I don't mean only the official peer review as solicited by journal editors, you know, to kind of articles that are submitted, but very generally peer review. Also, for example, when people, you know, in blogs or websites or repositories or even at conferences, when you give each other feedback on your work, right? So peer review in that very broad sense, it's great, but it has very high costs. And also, and this is something specifically about Longino's account, I think there's really not enough recognition of the inevitability of biases, of biased processes. So Longino has this idea, oh, you know, when you engage in critical engagement with each other, you know, it's going to kind of mitigate the effects of biases. I think she's too optimistic there. And again, it's a problem of scale, right? When the scale is very big, like, you know, contemporary scientific communities with thousands, millions of researchers involved, then you need curation, you need filtering, and that's when biases are going to kick in anyway. So first, on the point that peer review is resource intensive. So there's this one study that has estimated that the time that reviewers globally worked on peer review in 1 year, only into 2020, was over 100 million hours in 1 year. That's huge, right? There's a lot of time spent on that. And that means, right, so that scientific communities must engage in responsible collective workload management. And here a plug for a paper by Colin Riedberg, was a former postdoc of mine. He has this great paper on mathematical cranks. So he talks about, you know, like in mathematics, there's this phenomenon of like cranks. People are viewed as like, you know, cranks, as crackpots, as like not doing serious mathematics. And they're by and large ignored in the community. People don't engage with their papers, right? And they're just kind of, you know, in the margins. And most people think, oh, you know, this is very unjust. You should be more inclusive in mathematics, and right, you know, it's an epistemic injustice and whatnot. And in this paper, Colin says, no, actually, that makes perfect sense, because the mathematical community has to manage, you know, the collective workload of the community as a whole. So it's a really cool paper. I recommend that you check it out. So basically, what my account adds is the idea that there's this intrinsic vulnerability in peer review, which is that reviewers are requested to provide these very vital epistemic resources that are very costly to themselves, and they don't get much in return. Right? So going back to the idea of exchange. So what's in it for me as a reviewer? Basically, right? And remember that I said that, you know, one of the problems, one of the things that these mechanisms, these patterns of exchange are supposed to take care of is free riding. But for free riding to be, you know, avoided or at least mitigated, you need to keep track of who's doing who's doing what for whom, right? But peer review, at least in some disciplines, for example, not in mathematics, but certainly in philosophy, we want it to be anonymous, and for good reason. But that means anonymity doesn't go well with tracking for, you know, who's doing what, and therefore it doesn't go well together with the idea of keeping track of who's free riding, okay? And here, by the way, before I move to the kind of I want to say, I mean, I'm very much influenced here by my own work as a journal editor. So I was an editor for Synthese for about 4 years, and it was horrific. I mean, I was so busy all the time, especially because my colleagues, Otávio Bueno and Wiebe van der Hoek, are fanatics. I don't know how they do it. They're like working all the time, and they wanted me to do the same. And Synthese had this policy, I don't know if it still has, of having low rates of desk rejection. You know, most papers get sent out, and I was like constantly, you know, going after people and begging them to review papers, right? So my thinking on peer review is, of course, very much informed by my experience as an editor. I've also been an editor for other journals, but Synthese was like the hardcore experience. And of course, I've also been a reviewer, and I've also been an author, so I think I've seen many different sides of this system, okay? So remember that I said there are like these 4 types of exchange, right? So peer review, what kind of exchange is it? Okay, So first you could think, is it negotiated, right? We negotiate it because, right, you just kind of, you agree beforehand. No, it's not, because, you know, although this has been tried in some disciplines and there's actually some evidence saying that it might help, we don't usually get paid, right, for doing reviews. So it's not a transaction in that sense, right? So it's not a job for which we get paid, right? So there's this general idea, well, it's just service to the community. But it's not reciprocal, not in an obvious way, not in terms of like the reviewer and the author, right? Because the reviewer is giving much more to the author than the author is giving to the reviewer. Like very rarely, like let's be honest, very rarely we read papers that as reviewers like, oh, I learned a lot from this paper. That's great. I actually got something out of it. But most of the times, not really, right? And so we're giving a lot and getting very little in return. Of course, there is still some sort of reciprocal relationship between the reviewers and the editors. This is why, you know, what's really required for somebody to be a journal editor is for this person to have a lot of friends. Because you're basically using your social capital all the time, you know, and begging people, please, please do this. But when they accept to do a review for you, that means you're indebted to them as the editor, okay? So these two, right? So maybe you want to say, well, actually what's going on is actually it's generalized exchange. And that makes a lot of sense, right? Because this is something like I review a paper for this person for this other person, etc., etc. Eventually it goes back to me, right? So the reviewer's expenditure of cognitive and epistemic resources will be compensated when she herself submits a paper to a journal and receives reports from the peers, right? It kind of, what comes around goes around. That's the idea. And in principle, it sounds great, right? It would be great. I mean, that's like the theory of how it should be, right? But here again, we encounter the free rider problem, right? So of course, we can't really keep track of like, you know, journal editors we know, right? We know those of you who always say no to our referee requests. We're keeping track of that. And by the way, I'm one of those now, right? So now my, you know, the editors are like, oh, there's no point in sending a referee request to Catarina because she doesn't even reply. True, I'm very busy, so sorry. So we keep track of that, but otherwise it's basically this system doesn't really keep track of free riders. And the other problem here is that there's an asymmetry between the number of people who are submitting papers and the people who are viewed as competent to review the papers. Because in particular now, as we know, when you're still doing your PhD, when you're still a graduate student, you're very much encouraged to like publish as much as you can, right, to stand out in this very oversaturated job market. But most of the time, with some exceptions, but editors will not ask graduate students to review papers. So that means that necessarily the pool of authors is just much bigger than the pool of reviewers, right? So the idea of generalized exchange and like what I put into the system comes back to me just doesn't work, right, in this particular case, because many of the people who are taking things from the system cannot, at that stage of their careers, give back to the system as it were. Finally, you might say, well, what about productive exchange, right? Maybe we're just all kind of engaged together in this wonderful, enterprise of doing science together. And I think that's very much kind of like a Deweyan idea of science, right? So it's like collective enterprise. That's great. Look, I would love for it to be the case, for the world to be like that. But the problem is, of course, that productive exchange, thus understood, requires a largely cooperative background, right? It really requires for people to really see each other as collaborating. But of course, that's not how academia currently, and perhaps never, that's just not how it works, because there's hierarchies, there's competition, and people are really competing for very limited resources. So in that sense, it doesn't, the idea that peer review would be productive, the productive form of exchange, doesn't really seem to work, right? Not in the real world as we are now. So just to elaborate a little bit on the point that I've already made, the point about curation, right? So this was when I was editing a special issue for Topoi. But this is, of course, the editorial manager, but most of you will have seen something like this before. You probably you shiver when you see it, like nobody likes this platform, but it's very widely used by many journals. So here was just a special issue, so I didn't have that many papers that I had to handle compared to when I was at Synthese. But the point is, right, so like I said, when a scientific community grows beyond what the members can keep track of individually, you need curation mechanisms, right, become indispensable. Like, what should we pay attention to? And this is a problem of scale. Right? The bigger the community, the more you need to kind of find ways to manage attention in that community. And that's why gatekeepers, such as journal editors, but also moderators or chairs of program committees for conferences, etc., they must rely on heuristics to manage the allocation of these epistemic resources within that scientific community, right? Heuristics is the key word here. And so, for example, if you are an editor, right? So, like as I was, thankfully not right now. So when I receive a paper that first I have to decide, am I going to send it to reviewers or not, or am I going to desk reject it? If I say, yeah, I'm going to send it to reviewers, then I will have to choose reviewers for that, right? And these choices will always bear the mark of biases, of my own personal biases, right? And of course, they will bear the mark, or this process will bear the mark of reputation and status. So let me be more specific on this, and then here this is where you see the 3 tiers that I was talking about, actually the first 2 playing a role. So again, imagine I'm the editor, right? So who are the people who I think are potential peer reviewers that I could turn to in my network? So they are the ones that are visible to me somehow, right? And of course, visibility in these networks is not evenly distributed. Some people are more visible than others. And even though, if you are a diligent editor, what you should do is you get a paper and you don't think immediately of who you want to ask. You go to Phil Papers or Google Scholar, whatever, and you throw in the keywords and you see who comes up, and before you know it, there are all these people you didn't even know were doing great work, right? So there's a way to mitigate the effects of your limited kind of visibility of the network. But even then, right, it's going to be what the hits that you get back. And you're still going to be selecting, is this a good journal? I mean, can I trust that person? Because that's the second level that's so important. So the editor is deferring to the reviewers, right? To make a judgment on the paper. So I need to see the reviewer as sufficiently competent and sufficiently trustworthy to give me a good assessment of that paper on which I can base my decision, right? I will defer to the reviewer's expertise. So I need to trust, right, the reviewers. That's why I said there's a whole chapter on the book that's primarily about trust. So given this idea of deference, of trust, on the one hand, while biases can to some extent be mitigated, for example, by doing what I said, you go to Google Scholar or Phil Papers or whatever, you try to kind of look more broadly, there is still this thing about trust that there's no going around that. And I will trust the people who somehow I have reason to think are competent, right? And all these judgments of competence, they will be very much colored by my own preferences and biases and institutional networks, etc., etc. So one of the things, by the way, I'm not mentioning here, but one of the things that we see now that, of course, we're outside of Western Europe and North America, is that the pool of reviewers, if you take a particular area or journal, most typically reviewers, people who are actually doing reviews for top journals, they're 95% either from Western Europe or the United States and Canada, right? So there's a huge discrepancy there. There's really kind of a global inequality. And people from other places, in particular researchers from the global south, are extremely underrepresented in the pool of reviewers. And that, of course, is going to have an impact on the, on the judgments and therefore on what actually gets published. So it's really a matter of justice, but at the same time, there's no easy solution because I have to trust enough the person to know that she will be competent to give me a good, assessment of the paper, okay? So what I claim here is that the effects of attentional networks and of perceptions of trustworthiness are constitutive of the structure of large-scale epistemic exchanges. They cannot, it's not just a matter of, let's just do better and then we can mitigate them, which is kind of the Longino idea. I'm saying, no, you can't. So you might say, okay, what's the alternative? Maybe less gatekeeping. Of course, I couldn't resist and put another football reference, right? So you might say, well, maybe what you need is no gatekeeping at all. And of course, Liam Kofi-Bright and Remco Hazen and others have made suggestions in that direction. They say, well, you know, no gatekeeping, repository model, everybody can upload their papers and just let a thousand flowers bloom. Let's see, you know, what people think of the, you know, of the papers that's just dealing directly with them. But that doesn't work. Right? Basically, repositories themselves, archive and others, they end up reproducing all kinds of exclusionary mechanisms that you see anyway, right? So, for example, obviously, the papers by the famous people, they get a lot more attention. Secondly, well, now, of course, we were just hearing this, I think, was it from, no, it was yesterday, but also, I don't know, I think Craig said this morning. Now these repositories are actually having all kinds, precisely now because of AI-generated papers and paper mills, etc. Now, even to be able to upload a paper in a repository, you have to have all kinds of credentials, right? So either way, we're still, you know, we're still dealing with the same problem. And another thing is really interesting about archive is the classification categories, right? So those of you who do kind of philosophy of scientific practice in the exact sciences, you will know that there is this category general, right, in archive. And if your paper gets assigned to general, you know, it's like basically the waste basket, you know, it's the miscellaneous trash bag, and that in itself is already a mark of inferiority, okay? So either way, these models have the same effect. And also, I want to say that in a way, we are already dealing with a situation of too little gatekeeping with predatory journals, right? Predatory journals which publish almost anything because, of course, they get money from, you know, publishing articles. And it's a disaster, right? I mean, that very, you know, very bad papers are published, but then they get the veneer of respectability of being published in a journal, and then lay people or scientists from other fields, they consult the paper and they're like, oh yeah, that's what it is, and then it isn't, you know. So in a way, we are already in that position of less gatekeeping, and it's not working. So very briefly, I mean, just to kind of sum up how my framework compares to a Longinus framework that I started with. So first of all, we very much agree on the value of criticism for scientific practice, complete agreement there. Longinus says critical interaction, the more the merrier. This is this Millian idea. What my model says is that critical interaction is, yeah, it's good, but up to a point, right? Because of all these issues with costs and with risks involved. So CCE, of course, is a contextualist account. Our account is also a contextualist account, but I think we do better in terms of systematizing which parameters of contexts that are relevant, right, to describe these phenomena. In particular, we emphasize the role of trust and the role of attention in these processes. Then in CCE and similar frameworks, there's no explicit discussion of the finitude of agents, right, of the limited resources that we need to kind of deal with. Whereas in our model, we say, well, agents are constantly making these contrastive choices in view of their finite resources, so they're constantly engaging in resource allocation problems. And finally, there's no explicit discussion of the costs and risks of critical interaction. It seems like, you know, it's all good, the more the better. Whereas in our model, we talk about the need for communal workload management and resource allocation. So that's kind of, this is how it's related. So there are commonalities. I'm not completely disagreeing, but I think, you know, what I took to be the shortcomings in CCE, you know, at least we try to kind of make better in terms of taking those dead angles into account. So to conclude, all right, so these idealized models of scientific argumentation do not sufficiently emphasize these costs and risks that are involved in critical discursive interaction and argumentation in general. And on a large scale, filtering and curation are indispensable. So you might say, well, we can do better, it's a design problem. No, 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 it's really at the heart of this scale parameter. And so this model that we've been developing is meant to offer the conceptual tools to treat these particular aspects, right, of these interactions in a systematic way. And I think, at least that's what we try to do, that it offers then an account of argumentation and of science for busy people. which we all are. And I will close with, my motto these days. That's why I don't reply to emails. I have like an auto reply that says, sorry, send your email again until I reply. Thank you.